So what the Chancellor's announced today is quite a major fiscal consolidation. That means that he's both cutting spending, government spending from previous plans, and increasing taxes across a range of different taxes. So we've seen quite a lot of changes. And in total, that adds up to over £50 billion over the next 5 years. He's changed his own fiscal rules, which means that he's made that target a little bit easier for himself, moving from a 3-year target to a 5-year target. And the sum total of those things means that the government's plans will take the edge off a recession that we're now confirmed to be in. The other thing that we've seen, though, is that the OBR, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, they're the group of people who analyse, the independent group of people who analyse government fiscal policy, the same people that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng didn't want to report on their budget. The OBR have reported, and their judgment of our economic situation is really quite dire. We're in a recession, unemployment is going to go up. The living standards and real terms incomes of people have taken such a hit from these energy prices. And as we now know, those prices are going to go up. So the biggest thing that people will probably feel at home from today's announcements is that, one, their energy bills are going to be higher from March next year. Their wages are likely to not go up. And that means shrinking in real terms. And the unemployment is also going to increase in the country. And at the same time, we're cutting public spending, although some of that spending is end-loaded in several years' time after an expected general election.
Do you think that this Chancellor's reaction, what he said today, is it a typical Conservative Chancellor thing to do, or is it an unusual set of policies that he's put in place?
It's certainly an unusual set of policies, and it really is quite a handbrake turn from the policies that we've seen over the past few months with his predecessors. So first of all, many of your viewers might remember that Kwasi Kwarteng announced that they were scrapping that top rate of tax, the 45p rate of tax. Of course, when Jeremy Hunt became Chancellor, he reversed that decision. But one of the things that the Chancellor changed today is that he's actually lowering the threshold that top rate of tax is going to be paid. Not only that, he's freezing tax thresholds, which mean that as people's wages rise with inflation, more and more people will find themselves in those higher bands over time. So taxes are going up. Other unusual decisions include freezing the threshold in inheritance tax, and also changing the way that dividends and capital gains are taxed. That's income from wealth rather than income from work. We've thought for a long time that those taxes need to be increased and taxed fairly. So it's really interesting to see Jeremy Hunt starting to tweak around the edges of some of those taxes, although we think he can go further. And in fact, I think that the overall balance of this package is still potentially quite damaging for the economy. So choosing to split it slightly more towards spending cuts rather than tax rises, even though it's quite atypical for a Conservative Chancellor, I still think that might have been the wrong decision, as he could have gone further with tax rises and avoid some of those unnecessary cuts. But to your question, what will his colleagues in the Conservative Party think? I think some of these things could be quite challenging for them. So he's tried to package this as a plan for growth, but some of those forecasts are really still quite worrying. And those tax rises, I'm sure, will be concerning some Conservative MPs. Now, the UK, the tax burden in the UK will be high for British standards, but actually comparing ourselves to other developed countries, our tax rates still remain pretty low. So I think that they should probably take that into account.
Are you fairly sceptical then that what he's put in place is going to have the effect he wants it to have?
Well, I think certainly on the growth prospects, which is where we've been focusing and trying to work out what the Chancellor's policies actually mean, we're really quite sceptical there. So he dubbed this budget as a plan for growth. If we look at what the independent OBR are saying it's going to affect growth, what it's going to do is growth is falling at the moment because we're in a recession. The GDP of the country is shrinking, the economy is shrinking. So the policies announced today will take the edge off that. The recession will be shallower rather than deeper, which is a good thing. But if you look at once we pull out of that recession, we're actually not seeing any difference in our long-term growth. So it's not just me who's skeptical. The Independent Office for Budget Responsibility are also skeptical that those measures are going to have the desired effect. One of the other big things is that after March, the energy price guarantee, that price cap on gas and electricity bills, is going to be increased for people. So people will be feeling, again, a greater hit from their energy bills after March next year. And I think even though he still wants to market that as a cut, and it will be certainly a cut from actual oil and gas prices, which are expected to remain high for all of 2023, I think actually that will still have quite a significant impact on household incomes. He offered support for some of the poorest and most vulnerable houses, those on benefits. But as we know, with the increases that we've seen in energy prices, it's not just the poorest, it's actually the lower and middle income families who are now being hit by these impacts. What that means is that people will be spending less in the economy and potentially lengthening that recession. Although we are pleased to see some of the tax rises that he has proposed, because as I said earlier, some of those will be hitting people who can afford this, people who are doing quite well through this crisis.
You think it's reasonable for the Chancellor to say this is because of worldwide problems, or could some of it have been prevented?
So what the Chancellor says, which is absolutely correct, is that there is an international crisis at the moment. The core of this crisis that we're in at the moment is the lingering effects of the COVID pandemic on economies, accelerated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That is undisputed. That is the cause of the inflationary crisis that we're all feeling. What he didn't acknowledge, though, is that the UK is seeing a worse crisis than other countries. That's because we went into COVID and we went into this inflationary crisis, this energy crisis, less resilient and less prepared than other countries. We also had a weaker, more stagnant economy, which means that we're now the only country in the G7, that group of the 7 largest economies in the world. We're the only one of that group who haven't reached their pre-COVID economics level yet. So we're lagging behind our competitors, and we're actually still lagging behind where we were before March 2020 with the pandemic. So that's really quite a negative sign of the UK economy and our ability to bounce back and continue to grow compared to our competitors. They're way ahead of us. And now with that poor resilience, the energy prices being higher, inflation higher in the UK as well, that means that we're likely to see a longer and a deeper recession.
Do you think the energy situation is going to improve at any point soon?
So one of the things that we saw today was a release from the OBR on expectations of energy bills, and they're likely to remain high throughout 2023, and in fact quite a bit into 2024 as well. This crisis is not going to go away anytime soon, and of course we know that those prices remain unstable, and therefore we're very liable or very vulnerable to future global shocks. For example, if the war in the Ukraine worsens, or if there are other international supply chain crises, that means that our economy still remains quite susceptible to further shocks. One thing that it does show, though, is that after 2024, energy prices are likely to fall. Inflation is likely to fall back as well from the record highs that we've seen. It's actually forecast to go below zero for prices to fall. And that's largely dominated by energy prices coming back down, but also by other goods changing in price. The problem is that as much as the Bank of England doesn't want inflation to be high, it also doesn't want it to be low, and it certainly doesn't want it to be negative either. It's always aiming for 2%. It's a bit of a concerning sign that inflation might be falling negative, perhaps a sign of an over-tightening, that the Chancellor is going too far, perhaps overly contracting the economy at this time.
And what about interest rates? What is this going to have an effect? Are they going to go up again? Is it going to affect people's mortgage payments and that kind of thing, or are things going to settle down there?
Yeah, so interest rates again are forecast to remain high, and one of the things that the OBR have forecast is that house prices are actually going to continue to fall for over the next 12 months. So I think they're forecasting something in the region of a 9% fall in house prices, and that's primarily due to interest rates. This period of extremely low interest rates that we've seen since the financial crisis in 2008 does seem to have come to an end. They're expecting interest rates to remain quite high. Of course, the other side of interest rates, because they're not just on mortgage holders, they also reflect a higher rate of borrowing costs for the government in its own debt. And that's one of the things which is really contributing to this economic problem that the Chancellor is trying to solve today, is that borrowing costs are also forecast to be quite high. Although that is not the only problem that we're facing. And as most people will know, sometimes you have to borrow to grow. So this isn't a concern of saying that all borrowing is bad, but it does mean that those higher interest rates are feeding through into the budget that the Chancellor is addressing today.
Are there any positives in higher interest rates? Thinking about savers, is there any good news for anyone?
So higher interest rates are good news for savers. So anybody with shopping for a savings account or an ISA at the moment is likely to be able to find a much better rate than they did 12 months ago. Although we should also remember that when inflation is high, that's also, people call that a tax on savers. It's because if you're holding, let's say, £10,000 of savings, but inflation is going up, prices are going up every year, the value of that savings gets smaller and smaller. And inflation is still running faster than the interest rates that you can get on savings accounts. So if you're a saver, you're still likely to see an overall shrinkage in the size or the value of your savings, even if they're going up in cash terms.
And just finally, why was this an autumn statement and not a budget? And what is the next budget likely to have in it?
So it was an autumn statement because the order of fiscal statements is a bit out of order at the moment because of all the changes that we've seen over with the Liz Truss government. But typically a budget is what we will see in the spring, so in March and April, and we get then an autumn statement later in the year. So I can't say with certainty, but I think we're still expecting a budget in the spring, and that will likely be a continuation of the same plan, if this plan starts to work. Now, the thing that is quite notable about what Jeremy Hunt has announced today is that the majority of those cuts actually start to bite in several years' time. They're into that 2024, 2025 period when budgets start to shrink. So actually some budgets are continuing to rise over the next year. Now, some people would say that's the right thing to do economically. You don't want to start cutting during a recession, and I think that's true. But also with an eye on the politics, your viewers will probably, your listeners will know that's also after an expected general election. So he might be laying a little bit of a trap there for governments to come in the future, that they then might have to deal with those falling budgets as well.
And do you think there are any alternatives if there is to be an election, or if this were to be a Labour Party statement? What could have been done differently from an alternative perspective?
So what we were all urging the government to do over the past weeks, and we would continue to urge them to do, and any other party, is not to make these unnecessary spending cuts. There is a real risk that the reason that our economy is so weak, the reason our levels of investment are so weak, the reason we haven't grown to our pre-pandemic GDP like other countries have, is because we've spent the past decade salami slicing and cutting our public spending. That is not necessary. There is a way that you can still balance the books by investing in the productive capacity of the economy, investing in growing the economy with some prudent tax rises on those who are doing very well, so the wealthiest and those with the highest incomes. We think that's a fairer package. We think that aiming to consolidate the budgets with a higher proportion of tax rises would be the right thing to do. So there is an alternative, and if we get that alternative right, hopefully that wouldn't harm our growth prospects. It would mean we'd have a fairer and a more prosperous economy.